November 2, 1861. On a road outside Beijing, a funeral procession moves slowly south. At its center is a coffin of red sandalwood. Inside lies the Xianfeng Emperor, dead at 30. Flanking the coffin walk 8 men, the most powerful officials in the Qing Empire. Their leader is Sushun. Days earlier, he received a dying decree from the emperor himself, naming the 8 of them to guide a 5-year-old boy through the rule of Asia's largest empire. What these 8 men do not know is that an ambush has been waiting for them 3 days up the road. The person who ordered it is a 26-year-old widow. She holds no military command. She has no formal title. Months ago, she buried her husband. Her clan name is Xinyou. The West will come to know her as Empress Dowager Cixi. Over the next 47 years, she will rule China. Every war, every treaty with Britain, France, Russia, and Japan will pass through her hands. And the source of all that power lies in the next few hours on this road. How did she do it? To understand how she did it, we have to understand where she came from. She was born in Beijing in 1835. Her personal name has been lost to history. Her clan, the Yehanara, was one of many Manchu noble families. Her father was a mid-ranking official. The household was comfortable, not wealthy. In the Qing dynasty, every few years the emperor selected new consorts from the daughters of the 8 banners, the Manchu aristocratic class. This was not marriage in the ordinary sense. It was a state function designed to produce heirs for the throne. In 1852, at 17, she was chosen. She entered the palace at the rank of Lan Gui Ren, noble lady Lan, roughly mid-tier among the emperor's dozens of wives and concubines. Inside the palace, competition between young women was ruthless. There was only one path to victory: bear a son who survives. We need to pause and explain the rules of succession. A Qing emperor could have dozens of consorts. He could have only one empress. Below her in descending rank came imperial noble consort, concubine, noble lady, first-class attendant, and second-class attendant. Any son they bore was technically eligible for the throne. But who became crown prince did not depend on the mother's rank. It depended on something simpler: were you the only son still alive? Infant mortality in the imperial family was brutally high. The Xianfeng Emperor was frail to begin with, addicted to opium, and his children rarely survived. In 1856, the 21-year-old Lan Guiern bore a son. He was named Xichun. And this is what mattered. Of all the Xianfeng Emperor's sons, Xichun was the only one to live past infancy. That single fact transformed her. She was no longer just another consort. She was the mother of the future emperor. Her rank climbed noble lady Lan to concubine Yi to consort Yi, and finally to Yi Gui Fei, noble consort Yi. But notice, she was still not the empress. The empress was another young woman, 1 year younger, from the Niu Hulu clan. History would later know her as Xian. Xian had no children. So inside the palace, the structure was this. The emperor's wife had no son. The emperor's only son belonged to a woman who was not his wife. This was an arrangement that had to detonate. It simply had not yet. The fuse was lit by the British and the French. In 1860, the Second Opium War reached the capital. Anglo-French forces entered Beijing and burned the old summer palace, the Iwan Mingyuan. The Xianfeng Emperor fled the city overnight, taking the entire court with him. He went north to a mountain estate called Chengde. It was the traditional summer retreat of Qing emperors, beyond the Great Wall, about 250 kilometers from Beijing. At the time, the surrounding region was known as Rehe. the Xianfeng Emperor never returned to Beijing. In August 1861, he died at Rehe. He was 30 years old. Before his death, he did two things, and those two things decided everything that followed. First, he named the 5-year-old Zaichun as his heir. There was no real choice. Zaichun was the only living son. Second, he named 8 men to rule on the child's behalf until he came of age. History calls them the 8 regents. The most powerful was an imperial clansman named Sushun. He was sharp, hard, and capable. In Xianfeng's final years, he had effectively been running the government. By the emperor's design, the chain of power was clear. The 8 regents would govern. The boy emperor would sit on the throne in name. And the 2 imperial widows, Empress Xian and Cixi, Zaichun's mother, now elevated to Empress Dowager, would seal the decrees. That sealing detail mattered. On his deathbed, the Xianfeng Emperor handed each of the 2 dowagers a personal seal. Any imperial decree had to be drafted by the 8 regents, then stamped with both seals before it could take effect. In theory, this was a system of checks. The regents would govern. The dowagers would sign. But what if the dowagers refused to sign? The 26-year-old Cixi saw it instantly. So did the 8 regents. Both sides began, quietly, to count the other's strength. And at this moment, Cixi held a card the 8 regents had completely overlooked. That card was a man named Prince Gong, known personally as Yixin. His full ceremonial title was Gongqin Wangyizin. Yixin was the half-brother of the dead Xianfeng Emperor. To understand his place in this story, you need to grasp something counterintuitive. In the Qing political system, the emperor's brothers were dangerous figures. Why? Because by blood, they were just as legitimate as the emperor himself. If a brother was too talented, too well-connected, too popular, he could threaten the man on the throne. So the Qing operated under an unwritten rule. Imperial brothers could hold the title of prince. They could live in lavish mansions. They could appear at certain ceremonies. But they were deliberately kept away from the core of power. Yixin was exactly that kind of marginalized prince. Many officials thought him more capable than Xianfeng. There had even been a faction that wanted him to inherit the throne instead. That, in fact, became his curse. During his brother's reign, he was deliberately shut out of major decisions. But in 1860, when the British and French marched on Beijing, Xianfeng fled to Rehe and left the disaster behind. Who would negotiate with the foreigners? Who would clean up the city? Only Yixin. He was forced to stay in the capital, alone, facing the Europeans across the table. That one fact changed everything. In the course of those negotiations, Yixin built an entire network of his own. With foreign ministers. With the officials left behind in Beijing. With the newly created Zhongliamen, in full, Zhongli Jeguo Shiwu Yamen, the office for managing affairs with foreign nations. An isolated prince became, in practical terms, the most senior figure in the capital. Up at Rehe, the 8 regents had nothing comparable. None of them had ever dealt with a Western diplomat. What they wanted was traditional political power. What Yixin held was something new, a connection to the outside world and physical control of Beijing itself. The moment Xianfeng died in 1861, the 8 regents understood that Yixin was a threat. They made a move that was clever and ultimately fatal. They refused to let him come to Rehe to mourn the dead emperor. By ritual, when an emperor died, every brother had to come and weep before the coffin. The 8 found excuse after excuse to keep Yixin in Beijing. Officially, the capital could not be left without a senior figure in residence. Unofficially, they did not want him near the transfer of power. What they failed to see was simple. By keeping Yixin in Beijing, they left him alongside Beijing's garrisons, Beijing's officials, and the foreign powers, all of them far from regent control. And Cixi, deep inside the palace at Rehe, Cixi had already begun to send letters south. Sending those letters was itself a high-risk act. She had no open channel. Sushun's eyes were everywhere. From the surviving archives, we can reconstruct the method she used. It ran through a eunuch named Rehe. Messages were hidden inside routine palace paperwork, carried back to Beijing by attendants who attracted no attention, and placed in Yixin's hands. Yixin read them and began to plan. At the heart of the plan was a piece of ceremonial logistics. By tradition, the dead emperor's coffin had to be carried back to Beijing for burial. The full procession would take more than a week, with elaborate rituals at each stage and a heavy military escort. As regents, the 8 had to accompany the coffin every step of the way. But the 2 empress dowagers and the boy emperor were permitted to take a faster, secondary road, going on ahead to prepare the palace. It sounded entirely reasonable. The 8 agreed. That was their second fatal mistake. In late October 1861, Cixi, Xian, and the 5-year-old emperor set off ahead of the coffin. By the time they reached Beijing, the 8 were still on the road, walking beside their dead master's casket. The moment Cixi arrived, she met with Yixin. In a sealed room, the 2 of them finalized the plan. Yixin had already lined up the commanders of the Beijing garrison, several senior grand secretaries, the top officials of the Imperial cabinet, and most critically, a number of respected senior ministers willing to make a public charge. The charge that the 8 regents had betrayed the late emperor's true wishes. On the 2nd of November, as the coffin procession approached Beijing, waiting troops blocked the regents' carriages. Yixin stepped forward in person to make the announcement. By order of the 2 empress dowagers, the 8 regents were charged with usurping authority, betraying the late emperor's intentions, and were to be arrested at once. The 8 had no chance to resist. Their political strength existed inside court paperwork. Their personal escort was too small, too unreliable, and far too slow. Within a few hours, the entire group was under guard and on the road to the capital. On the 8th of November, Sushun was beheaded at Coup, the public execution ground in Beijing. Of the others, some were ordered to commit suicide. Some were sent into exile. The coup has a name in the history books. It is called the Xinyou coup, because 1861 in the traditional Chinese calendar was the year of Xinyou. From Xianfeng's death to Sushun's execution, the whole business took less than 3 months. A 26-year-old widow had taken an entire empire out of the hands of 8 veteran politicians, and she had not moved a single soldier. Now we need to explain a very particular institution. The Chinese call it Chui Lian Tingyong, literally, lowering the screen to hear government. In the Qing system, the emperor received his ministers in a hall called Yangzin Dian, the hall of mental cultivation. The emperor sat on the throne. The ministers knelt before him, reported business, and waited for his orders. It was an entirely male political space. The problem now was simple. The new emperor was 5 years old. He could neither follow what was being said nor make any decision about it. Traditionally, this would be handled by regents. But Cixi and Yixin had just dismantled the regency by coup. They were not going to install another one. The alternative was the screen. Behind the emperor's throne, they hung a panel of yellow silk. The 2 empress dowagers sat behind it. The ministers knelt before the throne and presented reports exactly as they always had. But the ones actually listening and actually deciding were the women behind the silk. The beauty of the system was that it preserved a ceremonial fiction. The emperor was still the emperor. The dowagers were merely assisting. Every decree, when announced to the world, went out in the boy's name. In reality, power lived entirely behind the screen. On the surface, Xian and Cixi were equals, both empress dowagers, both seated behind the silk. But Xian was mild-tempered and had little appetite for governing. Cixi was different. Cixi had interest, ambition, patience. Over the next 2 decades, Xian slowly faded from politics. She died young in 1881. From that point on, Cixi ruled alone. She lived until 1908, 47 years from the Xinyou coup to the day of her death. She watched 3 emperors pass beneath her, Tungji, Guangxu, and Shuantung. The fate of every one of them was decided by her hand. Her story has only begun here. Her dealings with the Western powers, the rupture between her and her own son, the Tongzhai Emperor, her house arrest of her nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, the Boxer crisis of 1900 and the Eight-Nation Alliance, all of these later cases trace back to that funeral road in 1861 and to that ambush. And the true beginning of all of it was a 17-year-old girl walking into the Forbidden City, deciding that whatever it took, she would survive and she would win. If you enjoy these Chinese power stories that Western histories tend to overlook, subscribe to our channel. Every week we take you deep into a real case from the Qing archives.